At the age of 7, a child can become the emotional anchor of the household, long before they're ready. It starts quietly, almost unnoticed. No one sees it happening at first, but the child begins to internalize the weight of the world in ways no child should ever have to. Maybe it's a parent struggling with addiction, or a parent lost in their own emotional turmoil, leaving the child to pick up the pieces. It's in the silent moments when the parent's face falls, when the arguments are too loud to ignore, or when the emptiness in the home is more deafening than any sound. The child, so small, makes a monumental realization. If I don't step in, if I don't hold everything together, no one will. And that's when the child begins to disappear, not physically, but emotionally. They take on the role of the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the emotional adult in a household where they should be the one being cared for. At such a tender age, a child's mind isn't equipped to process the depth of emotional labour they're being thrust into. They smile more than they cry. They stop expressing their own needs, learning instead to read the room, to anticipate the moods of others, and to react accordingly. They become the emotional thermostat, sensing the temperature of the room and adjusting their behaviour to maintain balance, sometimes at the expense of their own emotional well-being. And as society often does, it praises them for it. You're so mature for your age, you're so strong, so responsible. But no one ever asks, at what cost? No one ever wonders how much of the child's soul is being buried under the weight of these expectations. The truth is, these children grow up far too fast because they're forced to. They step into roles that no child should ever have to take on. And in doing so, they create coping mechanisms that help them survive, but ultimately harm them as adults. They hide their own emotions. They perform the role of the caretaker, the good child, the one who always has everything together. But underneath the surface, the real child, the one who needed protection, safety and care, remains buried. Over time, this version of the strong child becomes a mask, one that even the child themselves may forget to remove. And as they grow older, this survival mode stays with them, shaping their relationships, their sense of self, and how they view the world. What many people fail to realise is that the damage isn't obvious at first. On the outside, these children often seem to be thriving. They become high achievers, reliable friends, and responsible adults. But internally, they carry the silent grief of not having had a childhood. They never got to be the carefree, emotionally supported child they deserved to be. Instead, they were forced to take on a weight too heavy for anyone their age. They might become overachievers as adults, constantly proving their worth through success, pushing themselves to be strong because that's what they were praised for. But deep down, there's a part of them that aches because the child they were never had the opportunity to simply be. They were too busy holding everything together, far too young for anyone to notice. And in that quiet, unnoticed grief, the real cost of growing up too fast is buried. Parentification is a subtle form of trauma that rewires a child's brain in ways that last a lifetime. When a child is forced to take on the emotional responsibilities of an adult, it's not just an unfortunate situation, it's a developmental trauma that alters the way their brain processes emotions, relationships, and even safety. This process, known as parentification, happens when children step into roles such as the caregiver, the protector, or the emotional support system for parents who are unable or unwilling to fulfill these roles themselves. It's a survival tactic, but it's not a healthy one. Instead of developing naturally into an emotionally supported child, they're forced to grow up prematurely, shouldering burdens that are not theirs to carry. This early role reversal has profound effects. When a child is consistently asked to regulate not only their own emotions but also those of the adults around them, it creates something called hypervigilance. This means the child is always on high alert, constantly scanning their environment for signs of danger, whether it's emotional turmoil, conflict, or a parent's unstable mood. This heightened state of awareness keeps them in a constant state of stress, where they're not only worried about themselves, but also about the well-being of others. They learn to walk on eggshells, never quite sure when the next emotional storm will hit, and always ready to step in and try to fix things. As a result, these children grow up believing that love is a transaction. They offer peace, stability, and emotional support in exchange for safety or approval. They learn that their needs are secondary to the immediate needs of others, and in doing so, they suppress their own emotions and desires. They become incredibly adept at hiding their pain, their sadness, their fears, because those emotions are seen as too much or not as important as the chaos they're trying to prevent. The child's emotional world becomes a battleground, and they must constantly suppress their own needs in order to maintain the fragile peace around them. This hypervigilance doesn't fade with age. It becomes a deeply ingrained pattern that stays with the child as they grow into adulthood. The child learns to distrust stillness and peace because it feels unnatural. Their nervous system has been trained to accept chaos as the baseline, and when things are calm, it feels like something is wrong. The child may find it hard to relax or to trust that peace will last. They become conditioned to believe that only through constant action, through fixing, managing, or overperforming, can they earn safety or love. This constant state of emotional alertness creates a life where the individual is always on, always striving to meet the needs of others while ignoring their own. But this trauma doesn't just stay as a set of behaviours, it alters the way the brain functions. People who are parentified as children often find it difficult to trust themselves, their emotions, and their needs. They grow up to be adults who feel disconnected from their inner worlds, always caught in the cycle of trying to fix or please others, while silently wishing someone would just take care of them. This deeply ingrained survival mode can become a life sentence, where the individual feels constantly drained, overburdened, and unable to rest. They're stuck in a loop where they're living for others, never allowing themselves the chance to truly heal, grow, or simply be. And without acknowledging this trauma, these patterns can continue to impact their relationships, career choices, and their very sense of self-worth, leaving them in a perpetual state of emotional exhaustion. The mask of maturity becomes a survival strategy that is hard to take off. As children who grow up too fast step into roles that no child should, they begin to develop an identity that is built on strength, responsibility, and emotional suppression. They learn to bury their own needs in favour of managing the emotional landscape of their home, constantly striving to be the good child who can handle anything. They might be praised for their maturity, their ability to keep it together, and their unwavering reliability. But what's not seen is the toll this takes on their internal world. Over time, these children internalize the persona of the strong one, the one who doesn't need help, who can take care of everyone else while silently wishing someone would care for them in return. This survival strategy, though necessary in childhood, becomes a mask that these individuals wear so convincingly that they may forget it's not who they truly are. They perform the role of the caretaker, the mediator, the peacekeeper, and eventually it becomes so natural that it feels like part of their identity. But deep down, there's a void, a silent ache that they rarely address. The child that never got to be a child is still there. hidden beneath the layers of emotional strength and adult responsibility. The challenge is that this mask becomes so ingrained in their sense of self that they forget who they were before they started wearing it. They forget that their real needs for care, comfort, safety, and emotional expression are just as valid as the needs they constantly put aside for others. As they grow older, the mask of maturity can be incredibly difficult to remove. It can cause them to push people away because they feel the need to always be the strong one, the one who never asks for help. This becomes a self-sustaining cycle. By refusing to ask for help, they alienate others and continue to perform the role they've adopted. It's a lonely existence because, on the surface, they seem perfectly capable, even invincible. But underneath, they carry the weight of unaddressed grief, unresolved trauma, and unmet emotional needs. The very thing that helped them survive as children, their emotional control and responsibility, becomes the thing that isolates them as adults. The consequences of living behind this mask are often subtle, creeping into all areas of their life. In relationships, they may struggle to ask for support or to let down their guard. They might overfunction, always managing others' needs, never allowing anyone to take care of them. In their careers, they may be the overachievers, the ones who seem to have everything together, but they may also feel burnout or resentment because they are carrying a load that no one asked them to bear. The problem is, the longer they wear this mask of maturity, the more disconnected they become from their own emotions and true self. It's a survival mechanism that served them well as children, but as adults, it becomes an obstacle to true intimacy, vulnerability, and healing. The key to breaking free from this survival mask is awareness. Recognizing that the strength they've built through years of emotional suppression and caretaking was necessary for survival as children, but isn't serving them in adulthood, is the first step. Understanding that their worth isn't tied to how strong, responsible, or self-sufficient they appear to be can be freeing. The true work of healing begins when they allow themselves to remove the mask, to face their emotions, and to embrace vulnerability. They have to acknowledge that they're allowed to be human, to feel, and to ask for help without fearing that it will somehow diminish their worth. Only then can they begin to heal the hidden parts of themselves that were buried in the process of growing up too fast. The emotional numbness that accompanies growing up too fast is often mistaken for strength. When a child takes on the emotional labour of a parent, they quickly learn that showing emotions isn't safe or helpful. Crying, expressing sadness, or even showing vulnerability becomes a sign of weakness in a world where survival depends on emotional restraint and managing the chaos around them. Over time, the child learns to suppress their emotions, to push them down in favour of maintaining control and stability. But here's the catch: while this emotional numbing can seem like strength on the surface, it creates a deep disconnection from their feelings, making joy, love, and even sorrow feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or even dangerous. As adults, this emotional disconnection often becomes a core issue. They might experience moments of happiness, but something feels off. It's as if joy is fleeting, unearned, or even threatening. They might feel numb during what should be happy moments, celebrations, milestones, or moments of connection, because they were never allowed to fully experience those emotions as children. They were taught that joy was something that came after hard work, after fixing everything for others, after ensuring peace and safety. So when they do experience moments of happiness, they may struggle to believe it's real, or they may feel uncomfortable with the vulnerability that joy brings. This emotional numbness also manifests in their relationships. They may struggle with intimacy, pushing others away when emotional closeness feels too overwhelming. The act of opening up and sharing feelings is difficult because, for so long, they've been taught that emotions are burdens to be hidden, not shared. They may even downplay their own needs and desires, believing that to ask for anything is selfish or unworthy of attention. They might even be praised for their stoicism, for how well they handle difficult situations, but deep inside, they're still carrying the weight of unprocessed emotions that were never allowed to be expressed in their childhood. The real challenge comes when these adults begin to realize that their emotional numbness isn't a sign of strength. It's a defense mechanism that was necessary for survival, but is now holding them back from fully living. They've learned to prioritize others' needs over their own, to bottle up their feelings, and to continue performing the role of the strong one. But as they age, they start to feel the consequences of that emotional suppression. They feel disconnected from themselves, from others, and from the joy that should come with a life well lived. This is where the journey of healing begins. In order to truly heal, they must allow themselves to feel again, to sit with the emotions they've long suppressed and give themselves permission to experience vulnerability without fear. Healing means confronting the emotions that were buried beneath years of responsibility, chaos, and survival. It means allowing themselves to cry when it's necessary, to feel joy without guilt, and to accept that it's okay to ask for love and care. It's about learning to trust that feeling emotions, whether happy or sad, doesn't make them weak. It makes them human, and in doing so, they begin to reconnect with their true selves, with the parts of them that were buried in the pursuit of survival. The hyper-independence that often develops is a defense mechanism that becomes a barrier in adulthood. When a child is forced to step into the role of the caregiver, the protector, and the emotional caretaker for a parent or family member, they learn very quickly that relying on others is not an option. They become experts in self-sufficiency because they have to. Emotional support and security were never reliably available from others, so they learned to give that to themselves. They might grow up as incredibly capable adults, fiercely independent and highly functional, but deep down, they are carrying the quiet weight of never feeling safe enough to need anyone. Their autonomy becomes a way to protect themselves from ever feeling the vulnerability of needing others, a vulnerability that once caused them emotional pain as a child. In adulthood, this hyper-independence can look like someone who always says, "I'm fine," even when they aren't. They refuse help, never ask for assistance, and may even feel irritated when others offer support. This sense of, "I can do it all myself," feels empowering on the surface. After all, it's a learned survival tactic. They've been doing it alone for so long that they've become skilled at it. But the emotional toll is significant. This deep-rooted self-sufficiency makes it incredibly hard for them to accept help from others, even in situations where it's clearly needed. They feel uncomfortable with the idea of being vulnerable enough to depend on someone else, even if that dependence is healthy and necessary in relationships. The irony is that while they're hyper-independent and often praised for being so strong, they secretly long for connection, for the opportunity to let their guard down, and for someone to take care of them. But because they've been conditioned to never need anyone, they push people away, sometimes unknowingly. They might struggle to trust others or feel that anyone who tries to help them will eventually let them down. This belief that help is not only unnecessary, but also unsafe, stems from their childhood experience, where relying on others was an unreliable, potentially painful endeavour. The problem with hyper-independence is that it often masks an underlying fear of abandonment and rejection. The child who grew up too fast learned that people, especially adults, can't always be counted on. To protect themselves from further emotional harm, they turned inward, learning to only rely on themselves. As adults, they may isolate themselves or keep their relationships shallow because they've internalized the belief that they must be strong at all costs. This strength comes at the expense of true intimacy and vulnerability, which are essential for building authentic connections. Healing from this hyper-independence starts with allowing oneself to trust, to let others in, and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with accepting help. The first step is realizing that self-sufficiency, while an excellent survival tool, is not sustainable or healthy in the long run. It's about learning to ask for help when needed, to acknowledge that being dependent on others is not weakness, it's part of the human experience. It's okay to lean on others, to show vulnerability, and to express the truth that sometimes you need someone to help you carry the weight. Only by letting go of the false belief that you must always be strong can you begin to build deeper, more supportive relationships, and most importantly, allow yourself the grace of receiving love and care. The inability to rest and the constant drive for productivity is another consequence of growing up too fast. When a child is forced to be the emotional caretaker of their family, they learn early on that their worth is tied to what they can do for others. As a result, they develop a deep connection between self-worth and productivity. In a household where peace is precarious and survival feels like an ongoing task, rest becomes a foreign concept. The child learns that the only way to be valued is by keeping everything moving, by being the responsible one, by constantly taking care of things, whether it's a sibling, a parent, or the emotional temperature of the household. To rest, to pause, feels like a betrayal of their role as the caretaker. It's as if they're abandoning their post, and the chaos that they've learned to navigate and suppress will come rushing back if they stop moving. As an adult, this pattern can persist in subtle but significant ways. They may have trouble relaxing, even in the most peaceful settings. A weekend off can feel like an uncomfortable break in the rhythm, and guilt may creep in when they're not being productive. These adults often find themselves caught in the trap of believing that their value is only measurable by how much they do. Rest isn't seen as a restorative necessity, but as an indulgence, something they don't deserve unless they've earned it. They feel they must constantly be achieving, fixing, or managing in order to feel worthy of love or even their own approval. In a world that demands constant motion, this drive for productivity becomes a never-ending cycle of exhaustion, where the mind and body are rarely allowed to stop and simply be. This need to always be productive also extends into relationships and self-care. They might be the ones who constantly give, who take on the emotional labour of others, but who rarely allow themselves to receive care. They may take on too much at work, feel overwhelmed by personal responsibilities, and yet the idea of taking a break or asking for help can feel like failure. Rest isn't just a break for them, it's a luxury they haven't been taught to embrace. They feel like they must prove their worth by staying busy, by always doing something, and by constantly moving forward. Even when their bodies and minds are begging for a pause, they push through, ignoring the toll it takes on their well-being. This relentless drive for productivity can be linked to the deep fear of being unimportant or invisible. As a child, their sense of self was often tied to their ability to help. to fix things, and to maintain stability. The more they did, the more they felt valued. But as adults, this can morph into a harmful pattern where their identity is inseparable from what they accomplish. Their self-worth becomes externally driven, tied to their ability to perform and deliver. Rest, joy, and stillness feel dangerous because, for so long, they've been conditioned to see those as signs of weakness or failure. The first step in breaking this cycle is realizing that rest is not a reward, it's a necessity. Reclaiming the ability to rest means unlearning the beliefs that link self-worth to productivity. It's about giving yourself permission to pause, to breathe, and to recognize that you are valuable simply because you exist, not because of what you can accomplish. True healing comes when you allow yourself to rest without guilt, to give yourself the time and space to recharge without feeling like you're failing in some way. It's about finding peace in stillness and realizing that you are worthy of rest, of care, and of taking time to simply be. Only then can you begin to break free from the cycle of overdoing, overachieving, and overfunctioning that was once necessary for survival, but is now hindering your ability to live authentically. The fear of vulnerability is deeply rooted in a childhood spent managing others' emotions. Growing up too fast often means that a child learns to suppress their own emotional needs in favour of taking care of those around them. When a child is forced to be the emotional caretaker for a parent or sibling, they quickly learn that expressing their own feelings, especially vulnerable ones, can disrupt the fragile balance they've worked so hard to maintain. Emotions like sadness, anger, or even joy become dangerous because they might rock the boat and make things worse in an already unstable environment. As a result, these children grow up with a deep fear of being vulnerable. They might think that showing their true emotions, particularly negative ones, will lead to rejection, abandonment, or, worse, emotional chaos. So they build walls around their emotions, keeping them tightly contained and only showing what feels safe to the world. As adults, this fear of vulnerability often carries over into relationships, creating a barrier to true emotional intimacy. They may have difficulty opening up, not just because they're afraid of being hurt, but because they have been conditioned to believe that their emotions are either burdensome or unsafe to express. They may keep their feelings to themselves, withdrawing emotionally when things get tough because allowing someone to see them as they truly are feels too risky. This fear of being vulnerable is often mistaken for emotional detachment, but the reality is much deeper. These individuals long for connection, for someone to truly understand and accept them, but they've learned that showing their full, authentic selves can lead to hurt. They fear that if they let their guard down, the emotional chaos they learned to manage as children will resurface. This tendency to suppress emotions can make them feel isolated and misunderstood in relationships. They may push others away when things start to get too close, fearing that if they allow someone to see their true emotions, they will be rejected or abandoned. They might also overfunction in their relationships, taking care of everyone else's emotional needs but never letting anyone meet their own. This creates a dynamic where they become the strong one, the reliable one, but never the one who is truly cared for. In some cases, they may even sabotage relationships subconsciously, finding ways to keep things from becoming too intimate because vulnerability feels too unsafe. However, healing begins when these individuals recognize that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's a strength. The key to breaking free from this fear of vulnerability is understanding that emotions even painful ones, are a natural part of the human experience. Vulnerability isn't about being helpless or exposed. It's about being honest with yourself and others, about letting down your guard and allowing others to see the real you. In doing so, you create the possibility of deeper, more authentic relationships, where love and connection can truly thrive. To move past this fear, individuals who grew up too fast need to unlearn the belief that showing emotion makes them weak or unsafe. It's about taking small, courageous steps toward emotional honesty, starting with themselves. This means acknowledging their own emotional needs, giving themselves permission to feel, and practicing being vulnerable in safe spaces where they can begin to trust that it's okay to let go of the mask. Over time, they can begin to build relationships where vulnerability is met with empathy, not judgment, and where emotional intimacy becomes a shared experience rather than a solitary burden. This process can be painful and uncomfortable, but it's also the gateway to true healing, the kind of healing that allows them to finally let go of the survival mode they've been living in for so long and embrace a life full of real, unguarded connection. The inability to set boundaries is often a direct result of childhood responsibilities that weren't theirs to carry. Growing up too fast means that the child learns from an early age to suppress their own needs in favour of taking care of others. In an environment where peace is fragile and survival depends on keeping the emotional temperature stable, boundaries often don't exist, at least not in the way they should. A child who is forced to become the emotional caretaker for their parents or siblings quickly learns that their own needs aren't important. They're conditioned to believe that love and attachment come from serving others, fixing problems, and making sure the people around them are okay. As a result, they may have no concept of what healthy boundaries even look like. As they grow older, this lack of boundaries becomes a significant challenge in their personal and professional lives. They may struggle to say no to others even when they're overwhelmed. They might take on more than they can handle, pushing themselves to the brink of exhaustion, simply because they were never allowed to recognize or honor their own limits. They might also feel a deep sense of guilt or anxiety when they try to set boundaries, fearing that doing so will lead to rejection or abandonment. For them, saying no feels like betraying the person they were taught to be, the reliable, selfless caregiver who never asks for anything in return. In their minds, setting boundaries is the same as being selfish, and they equate selfishness with unworthiness. This inability to establish healthy boundaries often shows up in relationships where they may give more than they receive. They overfunction, constantly managing others' needs, but never taking the time to assess or express their own. They may feel drained, resentful, or emotionally burned out because they're giving so much of themselves without receiving the same in return. But here's the catch: because they've been conditioned to believe that their worth is tied to how much they give and how much they care for others, they have difficulty accepting that relationships should be reciprocal. They might fear that if they stop giving, they'll lose the connection, or worse, they'll be abandoned. The impact of not knowing how to set boundaries can be far-reaching. These individuals may find themselves in toxic relationships, where they're constantly giving but never getting. They might attract people who are emotionally needy or who take advantage of their inability to say no. They could also find themselves in demanding work environments where they overperform, take on excessive responsibilities, and burn out without ever feeling truly appreciated. In both personal and professional settings, they're constantly walking the line between being selfless and losing themselves entirely. Healing from this lack of boundaries begins with recognizing that they're allowed to have needs, to ask for help, and to say no without guilt. Learning to set boundaries is about realizing that they're worthy of the same care and consideration that they so freely give to others. It's about unlearning the belief that their value is tied to their ability to be a caretaker, and instead recognizing that their value is inherent regardless of how much they give. The process of setting boundaries can feel uncomfortable at first, especially when it goes against the survival mechanisms learned in childhood, but it's essential for healing. The first step is understanding that boundaries are not about being selfish. They're about protecting oneself so that they can show up in relationships and in life as their authentic whole self. Over time, individuals who struggle with boundaries can begin to practice setting small, manageable limits. They can learn to say no in ways that honour their own needs, while still being compassionate toward others. They can begin to recognise that taking care of themselves is not only necessary, it's the key to building healthier, more balanced relationships. Ultimately, setting boundaries is about reclaiming control over one's life, identity, and well-being. It's about recognising that they are worthy of respect, that their needs matter, and that it's okay to prioritise their own emotional health. This is a transformative step toward healing, one that allows them to break free from the old patterns of emotional caretaking and begin building a life where they can finally live for themselves, not just for others. The inability to receive love or care is a silent wound that many adults carry from childhood. When a child grows up too fast, forced into roles of caretaker, mediator, or emotional support for a parent or family member, they internalise the belief that their value comes from what they give to others, not from simply existing. In this environment, receiving care or affection feels foreign, even uncomfortable. They've learned that love is something you earn by doing, by taking care of others, managing crises, and maintaining emotional stability for everyone else. As a result, they develop an unconscious block when it comes to receiving love, kindness, or help from others. It's as if accepting anything for themselves feels wrong or even dangerous. As adults, this dynamic becomes especially painful in relationships. The individual who grew up too fast may feel like they need to constantly give, care for, or fix their partner's problems, but struggle when it's time for their partner to reciprocate. They might feel undeserving of love, or find themselves rejecting affection or assistance, even when they deeply need it. This isn't because they don't want love or support, it's because they've never been taught how to accept it without guilt or fear. They may push people away when they sense care coming toward them, either out of fear that they won't be able to return the favour, or because they feel overwhelmed by the vulnerability that comes with receiving. This inability to accept love also stems from a deep-seated belief that needing someone else makes them weak or unworthy. When you're conditioned from a young age to believe that you must be the strong one, the responsible one, the caretaker, it becomes nearly impossible to relax into the role of the one who receives. The very idea of being cared for, of being held and supported, feels unnatural. The fear that others might view them as incapable or needy can lead to pushing people away at the very moments when they need them most. In relationships, this can manifest in multiple ways. They may avoid letting their partner take care of them, even during times of stress or illness. They might reject help, even when it's offered with love, because receiving it feels like a form of emotional vulnerability that they were never allowed to experience as a child. Over time, this builds emotional walls that prevent them from truly connecting with others. They can give and give, but the idea of receiving feels threatening, as if it might expose them, make them too vulnerable, or somehow unworthy. They may also find themselves in relationships where they constantly overgive, seeking to prove their worth, but never feeling fully fulfilled because they're not allowing themselves to receive the same level of care in return. Healing this wound begins with recognizing that love isn't a transaction. It isn't something that must be earned by giving or performing. Love, true love, is unconditional and reciprocal. But before this can be understood and embraced, the individual must first confront the deep-rooted belief that they are only worthy of love if they're giving something in return. This requires unlearning the idea that their emotional needs are secondary to the needs of others. The first step to healing is to begin allowing themselves to receive care, even in small ways. It might start with accepting a compliment graciously instead of deflecting it, allowing someone to help with something without feeling the need to repay them, or simply sitting in stillness and allowing themselves to feel loved without having to do anything for it. Over time, as they start to let down their guard, they begin to recognize that being vulnerable and allowing others to care for them is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. The key to healing is understanding that receiving love is just as important as giving it. By allowing themselves to be cared for, they can break free from the emotional isolation they've carried for so long. It's a transformative experience, one that teaches them they're worthy of love just as they are. It's about dismantling the walls built from years of emotional caretaking and learning to let others in. And when this happens, they can finally experience the fullness of love and connection in a way that's not based on performance, but on mutual, unconditional acceptance. Healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about embracing what was never allowed to grow. For those who grew up too fast, the journey toward healing is not about erasing the scars of their childhood or forcing themselves to move on from their past. It's about understanding that the trauma they experienced isn't something to be discarded or ignored. It's a part of them that must be acknowledged and integrated. The child who was forced to suppress their emotions, take on adult responsibilities and neglect their own needs did not have the luxury of experiencing the world as a child should. They didn't get to play freely, express their feelings openly, or receive the emotional care they deserved. These experiences shape their identity and how they interact with the world, but they don't define who they are at their core. The first step toward healing is witnessing what happened. This may sound simple, but it's profound. Many of these individuals have spent their entire adult lives minimizing their trauma, convincing themselves that it wasn't that bad, or that others had it worse. They may have lived with the belief that because they survived, they don't need to grieve, or that they should just be grateful for what they've accomplished. But healing requires more than just moving on. It requires them to go back to the child they once were, the one who never had a voice, who quietly accepted responsibility they should never have had to take on, and finally say, "I see you, I hear you, and I'm not leaving." This acknowledgement is crucial because until these unmet needs are validated, the person will continue to carry that suppressed grief, often without even realizing it. The work of healing involves sitting with pain and grief that was never processed as a child. It's about allowing oneself to feel the feelings that were buried under layers of survival mechanisms. The rage, the sorrow, the confusion that was never allowed to be expressed. Those emotions must be felt and honoured. Healing isn't a linear process, and it doesn't mean fixing the past. It's about giving oneself permission to finally feel the hurt that was silenced for so long. to mourn the birthdays where no one showed up, the moments of joy that were never fully allowed, the childhood lost in the attempt to be strong for others. This grief is not a sign of weakness, it's proof that they are finally healing, because the parts of them that were once frozen and buried are finally coming to the surface. As adults, the trauma of growing up too fast manifests in the need to fix others, to take on too much responsibility, to constantly perform, and to suppress their own needs. They may overfunction in relationships, always taking care of everyone else while secretly wishing someone would just take care of them. The adult may struggle with setting boundaries, saying no, or asking for help because they've internalized that their worth is tied to their ability to give and manage others. But these aren't personality flaws, they're survival strategies learned in childhood. To truly heal, these individuals need to unlearn those patterns. They must stop idolizing their own strength and start honoring the wounds that form the foundation of their survival. Healing also means learning to receive care. It means giving themselves permission to ask for help, to be vulnerable, and to trust that they're worthy of love and emotional support. It's about letting go of the belief that they have to be strong all the time, or that their value is tied to how much they can do for others. The process involves turning inward and nurturing the parts of themselves that were neglected and ignored in their childhood, giving those parts the attention they deserve. By nurturing their inner child, they can begin to restore the parts of themselves that were never allowed to fully develop. At its core, the healing journey is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you how to be. It's about reuniting with the parts of yourself that were buried in the pursuit of survival. For those who grew up too fast, the journey is one of self-rediscovery, a journey that honors their strength and resilience, but also embraces their vulnerability, their softness, and their ability to receive. Healing is about reclaiming your right to rest, to feel, to ask for help, and to trust that you don't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. You get to choose who you are now, and for the first time, you get to grow up the right way, not under pressure, not in fear, but in truth and in love for the person you've always been.